The History of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Season 1, Episode 4, The Bracelet, the podcast starring Jeff Garlin and Susie Essman. My insights on their insights coming up right after this. Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Yoel and so grateful to have you as always. And in today's video, I'm going to carry on with my playlist of videos on the history of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is a fantastic web series starring Jeffrey Garlin and Susie Essman. And we're discussing season 1, episode 4, called The Bracelet. And I'm going to continue with my insights on their insights to give you a fan's perspective. If you haven't seen the previous videos, I suggest that you do, to give you some more context as we lead up, starting with the introduction of the series, moving through to various episodes now in episode 4 of season 1. So let's jump right in. Oh, and just to mention, I almost forgot, what I started doing is now I've been rewatching the episodes that they're discussing before I watch their actual podcast, just to give me a little bit more added context. So a lot of my insights are on what I noticed in seeing the show. A lot of them are on what I noticed from their insights, that's Jeff and Susie's, on the podcast, and it kind of mixes together. And I just thought it would be interesting for you, the viewer, to get a fan's perspective. So it's kind of an added insight, just because of how deep the show goes. There's room for everybody's insights, and I always welcome you to leave your comments and thoughts in the comment section below. Okay, so without further ado, the first thing I jotted down here, it's funny, Jeff's first words on this episode are "by the way," which I've seen in various comments on the YouTube channel that they have. Jeff is always saying "by the way," and I love you, Jeff. If you're watching this, you're great, you're fantastic. You just use the term "by the way" a little bit too much. I know you'd be laughing about it and self-deprecating, and I say this lovingly, but man, you say "by the way" a lot. I know that I do every once in a while, but you really use that term a lot. And the first words that came out of your mouth in this episode, I just had to point that out. Now, the show actually started, back to the show, leaving aside picking on Jeff. The show starts off with Larry watching a football game. It was interesting to note that because of their budget, I guess they couldn't get footage from an actual Jets game, which is, Larry's favorite team, the New York Jets. So instead, they got some footage from like the Vikings or the Cowboys or something like that. Interesting. I didn't notice that when I was watching the show. And I'll get into what the audience may notice versus what the actors know and are self-conscious about. I'm going to get into that in a second. But the point is, he's not actually in real life watching the Jets game, but on the show, he's watching the Jets game. And we know that Larry really is a football fan. I've watched Larry on all sorts of different sports podcasts. Rich Eisen, he's been on, I'm forgetting his name now. There's another one, forgive me, very well-known sports guy who has this podcast, and I can't remember his name. But the point is that Larry actually is a football fan. So a lot of the shows already from the first season have started with different sporting or games types of things. So for example, we had the Ted and Mary episode, which started with bowling. We had, I don't know if it was the first episode or it was the Porno Gill episode 3, where it starts off with Larry at the driving range golfing, and we know that Larry actually is a golf fan. So interesting that in the show, he's really incorporating a lot of what he's really interested in. Although the discussion about bowling, we're not sure. Jeff and Susie said they're not sure if Larry was actually a bowler. And I'm still curious to know if anybody has any information out there, maybe from one of LarryDavid's interviews. Please put that in the comments. But in any case, Larry starts out watching a football game. And of course, Cheryl walks in from a trip, and Larry just cannot focus. He's watching the game. It's the last 2 minutes, which obviously is the most important time. And I noticed that as a guy, that is something that happens to all of us. Somebody walks in, for me, it could be my children. Anybody could walk in at the last 2 minutes of a game, and they're talking to you. You're like, can you just wait a couple of minutes? And Jeff actually comments on this as well, that it always seems to happen with us guys. It's funny, Jeff says that he never does it to women. And Susie adds over there that don't make this a gender, she doesn't say those words, but don't make this a gender thing, because I myself am a New York Giants fan, and I would know to never do that to my husband. So it is an interesting dynamic playing out, and it plays out art imitating life in this Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. And also, I found myself agreeing with Larry when Cheryl gets upset at him and she's being cold to him. And Larry says, well, if it was the Oscars and they're about to announce Best Picture or Best Actor or whatever, I wouldn't start talking to you. I would wait because I would understand. And Jeff says that that's a true point. that a lot of guys would pick up on that. And I agree. I found myself when Larry was saying that he's right. I actually agree with him. Like, we would use that discretion. We would never try to interrupt a woman who's watching the Oscars. By the way, I myself am going to watch the Oscars. I'm going to do a video about that. It's kind of a funny video about the fact that I'm a guy and I'm straight and I'm watching the Oscars. I enjoy the Oscars. But in any event, we can agree that it's probably watched from a demographic perspective, probably more by women than men. And Larry makes that point to Cheryl, which of course falls on deaf ears. And subsequently, Larry finds himself having to apologize and get Cheryl a gift. And the apologizing thing, I'm actually surprised that Jeff and Susie didn't talk about this, but that's a common, they've talked about in other episodes, how Larry apologizing is really a theme that pervades Curb Your Enthusiasm throughout all the seasons and episodes. So it's very interesting that here again, we find in episode 4, Larry finds himself in a position of having to apologize to his wife, Cheryl. And something that was, so I talked about before about what actors and those in the production know about the show, such as the game was not actually a Jets game, whereas the audience doesn't really pick up on that. I don't purport to speak for all the audience members, but I'm a big Curb fan, and I never picked up on the fact that it wasn't actually a Jets game. And Jeff talks about that, and you can see he's kind of self-conscious about it, not like he's losing sleep about it, but he talks about the fact that they had that shoestring budget. And he also mentioned a couple of other things which I found interesting that I myself did not pick up on. He talks about Larry's beard. It's a fake beard, okay, because he wasn't shaving. I obviously noticed that he had that growth. I didn't know if it was fake or not. Obviously, Larry doesn't have a beard in every scene, and it would be highly unlikely for Larry to actually grow a beard for this one particular episode. But the point is that as an audience member, I didn't care. I wasn't focusing on that at all. I noticed the premise that he's unshaven, and that's all that mattered to me. But it's interesting that Jeff is kind of pointing out the fact that it was such an obviously fake beard in our budget and yada, yada. And same with their bedroom. He says, like, that's the type of bedroom that college kids would have, not somebody of Larry David's net worth. But I didn't even notice it watching the show. To me, it was just a bedroom. I didn't notice the linen. Susie's talking about the linen. These are things that, you know, if any show is worried about working on a shoestring budget and getting away with, you know, maybe things that wouldn't mirror true life per se, I can tell you as an audience member, as a fan, it's not something that we really, again, I don't want to speak for everybody, but it's not something that I cared about, that's for sure. Now, once again, we talk about Richard Lewis, who is just brilliant, holding his own with Larry. And you can see the banter and the laughter. And, you know, at one point, Richard says to him, "What are we, in the shmata business?" And, you know, just a Jewish reference for those who are not Jewish. Shmata is, means like textiles. A lot of Jews, definitely in the past, not as much these days, but a lot of Jews went into the textiles business. And shmata means textile. And, you know, Richard Lewis obviously being Jewish, as well as Larry David, as well as Jeff Garlin and Susie Essman, I believe. You know, Richard Lewis says, what are we in the shmata business?" And the banter is going on, and Larry's talking about, you know, why the penis is grotesque to women, and on and on and on. And Richard Lewis goes back and forth with him. And you got to think that most of this is ad-libbed by Richard Lewis. So Richard is really holding his own with Larry. And you just see the joy, and I'm not suggesting it's easy, but you see the joy of them working together, and you just know they're having a great time doing it. Because as Susie points out, which I did see in another interview of Larry David, that him and Richard Lewis were actually dearest of friends for the longest time, I think for 50 years already, more. So you really see that playing out well on the screen. And something else, I was happy that I noticed this. I'm not from LA, but I remember when I visited LA, I'm a big walker, okay? But when I went to LA, I realized like nobody walks anywhere. Like everybody drives everywhere. Although when I was visiting my friend in LA, and this was a couple of years ago, he has a gym that's within about 15, 20 minutes walking. And he thought I was crazy when I told him I'm going to walk, which to me is ironic, because you're going to the gym, you want to be in shape. Why not walk and get added exercise? I get it if, you know, I was visiting, I was on vacation, so I'm not in a hurry. I could take my time, and my friend is maybe rushing to get there so he can get on with his day. But the point is that, you know, Susie points out how nobody walks in LA. And in the show, you know, Richard out of the blue decides that he wants to walk with Larry from the jewelry store to the restaurant, and nobody really would do that. So I did notice that as well. When I went to LA, nobody walks, everybody drives. And what's frustrating, I find, for drivers over there is that there's a ton of traffic. Oh my God, LA has so much traffic. I actually love LA, but the traffic is something I can do without. But interesting, I was gratified that that's something I noticed, that nobody would actually walk in LA, and that's something that Susie Essman talks about as well in the podcast. Now, something else Jeff and Susie talk a lot about the fact that in real life, Larry is very particular and fussy about his hygiene and, a bit of a germy or whatnot. And in the show, when he encounters the homeless person, he doesn't shake his hand. If you notice, he kind of just like, if you're watching this, he kind of like nudges at him with his elbow and doesn't actually shake his hand. And that's probably something Larry would do in real life. Although I think Larry, I know from what I've watched, and I did a video on this, Larry actually really is a good guy in real life. So I don't know if he would make somebody feel bad like that, but there is a good chance that if he was concerned about his hygiene, he probably would not shake the person's hand. And in the show, he does that as well. And this is also interesting what made Seinfeld so incredible? It was a show based on observational humor, right? Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David are really, the masterminds of observational humor. They're really geniuses at it. And here in Curb Your Enthusiasm, we see that delightfully, as Jeff would say, playing out at the restaurant where Larry David's getting into a whole riff about the captains versus the waiter and who gets what tip, and is the waiter going to give it to the captain? Why should I tip them both? And really, it's a beautiful observational humor, so vintage Larry David, and it just works beautifully into the show. And also, I wanted to point out that Larry actually has the best of intentions. He wants justice. Okay, he wants that waiter. He doesn't want the waiter to get everything. He doesn't want the captain to get everything, but he doesn't want to be, he wants to be magnanimous with his tip, but he wants everybody to be happy. It's vintage Larry David. He wants to do the right thing. He wants justice. Of course, he ends up getting bitten in the ass as a result of it, but really he had good intentions. And something I found interesting as well is that Jeff and Richard encounter a blind fellow on the way back from the restaurant on the way to the jewelry store. And the blind person in real life is not actually blind. It's played by an actor who's not blind. And I thought it was interesting. Jeff points out that nowadays, maybe even then as well, when they filmed it, although it was over 20 years ago, they would do their best to give a blind person every opportunity to have the same role that a non-blind person would have. So I found that interesting. I didn't really think about that when I was watching the show, but that is a nice added insight that I wouldn't have known had I not been watching their podcast. So thanks for that, Jeff. And funny enough, Jeff says, I know a lot of you out there may agree or disagree. A lot of you are going to think I'm a moron. And you know what? I am a moron. I love the way Jeff says that. It's perfect, Jeff. I love it. Now, the other thing that's funny is that Larry points out that the blind man who says it's just going to be a few minutes when he meets them, of course, we know that's not what's going to happen. He ends up asking them to do a million things that were not a few minutes. It was much more than a few minutes, so much so that they end up missing the jewelry store's opening and it closes. And Larry says he was a deceptive blind man. And Jeff and Susie kind of talk about this. He was a deceptive blind person and he was an asshole. He's yelling at them. He's being sarcastic. And it's just such a vintage Larry David. In later episodes, we'll see he's got an episode about a woman in a wheelchair and all sorts of things that only Larry David would think up and kind of, push the boundaries of what's acceptable or not acceptable. Nowadays with wokeness, you got to wonder if Larry would have done these episodes, because I know Larry's more liberal minded, although he does like to push the envelope. But the funny thing is that he gets into a whole riff about the blind man being a deceptive asshole. Well, he doesn't say asshole, I'm adding that word, but being a deceptive blind person. And he's right. The blind man was deceptive, and I would add he was an asshole. And anyway, so the jewelry store closes, and then Cheryl comes back to Larry the next morning and says, I saw, or that evening, I saw the jewelry, I saw that bracelet in the window of the jewelry store, and I'd like to have it. And of course, Larry had already told Richard that Richard could go ahead and buy it for his girlfriend. And it becomes a whole thing. Something that I noticed that was interesting to me was that Cheryl could have actually bought the bracelet on her own, okay, unless she drove by it when the jewelry store was closed already. That doesn't get talked about in the storyline, but she wants Larry to buy it for her as a gift. I always found that interesting. When I was, married to my wife of yore, and I know, Jeff, you're trying to come up with a better terminology. I'm just mirroring yours. But when I was married to the wife of yore, she wanted gifts as a surprise. I have a lot of friends who actually discuss gifts with their wives, and they would bring, they'll agree on what they're going to buy. And even though the wife could buy it on her own, technically, she wants it to be bought as a gift. And I understand that. We can get into the whole discussion of love languages. A lot of people, their love language is gift giving, gift receiving maybe. But the point is that I just noticed that it was something that Cheryl arguably could have bought it on her own, but instead she really wants it to come as a gift from Larry. Not as a peace overture, not as a making up gift they had already made up with flowers, but more just because she wants it to come as a gift from Larry. But it was interesting to note that Cheryl really could have bought that bracelet on her own. And then, of course, Larry, the next morning, he's getting up bright and early. He's getting dressed. He's putting on a suit. He's being all suave, if that's the word. And then you've got that fancy music playing in the background. I just thought it was funny, you know, knowing how casual Larry is, to see him getting dressed up and just to add that music interlude in the background, I thought was a great piece to the narrative, and showing how Larry is being all fancy to go to the jewelry store. And then what happens is, of course, Larry has to pick up his credit card because he had forgot his credit card at the restaurant. And then he goes there and he runs into the captain, who he had unintentionally screwed over the day before, thinking that the waiter's going to tip the captain. Of course, he doesn't. And I did find myself thinking too, like, how petty is this captain? I mean, would anybody do this in real life? It's funny that Larry oftentimes is made out to be the jerk in the show. But as we know, Larry really, you know, I'm not the bad guy. As Larry says oftentimes in a lot of the later shows, I'm not the bad guy. And in this scene too, Larry was not the bad guy. Maybe Larry should have just, you know, let it go and tipped both the captain and the waiter. Of course, you know, he could definitely afford to. But in any event, the captain being petty and refusing to move his car that was blocking Larry, that was really petty, as Susie, and I was as gratified, I should say, that Susie pointed this out in the podcast as well. But it definitely helps bring the storyline along, because then Larry finds himself having to run, not just walk. So we talked about walking in LA. He has to run in a suit back to the jewelry store, because why? He has to beat Richard Lewis. And of course, who does he run into? Richard Lewis. And in the podcast, Jeff talks about the actors who have auditioned for the show, which I thought was very insightful and very interesting. And he said that something that, you know, a lot of us as fans don't know, which is how difficult it is to play oneself. And I remember watching Jason Alexander talking about the episode later on in Curb, where there's the Seinfeld reunion, and he's playing himself, but Jason Alexander says, I'm playing this like completely fictionalized version of myself. I'm playing a complete asshole. Like, I would never be this way in real life. And I just thought back to that when Jeff was saying how difficult it is to really play yourself in a show. And that was just intriguing to me. One would think, how hard could it be to play yourself? But Jeff is saying, no. To play yourself is actually very difficult. And then when they're speaking about actors on the show and auditioning process, Jeff said something that was very interesting to me. He said that the key to getting onto the show as an actor is just to be a person. And what I would add to that is that that's a key to life as well. A lot of us try to be somebody we're not. We try to put on airs. Just be yourself. Okay, that's very cliche and it sounds like a platitude and very trite. But in reality, that's an important component to succeeding in life, is to learn to accept yourself and to be yourself. So not only is that important to be able to be an actor and curb your enthusiasm, but to be a person in life, just be yourself. So finally, we get to the last scene and Larry encounters Richard Lewis, and then they have a race to get into the jewelry store first. And just to see two grown men fighting literally in, like, not a fisticuffs, but they're kind of tumbling around and rolling around. I wonder if those were stunt doubles, by the way. Jeff and Susie don't mention that. I'd be curious to know if it was actually Larry and Richard doing that, or if they had stunt doubles. It certainly looked like it was actually them. But in any case, that was just a golden ending to the show, just to see them both fighting. Of course, Larry prevails, but as you know, there's no way the jewelry store owners are going to let him in after all that. So ultimately, Larry walks away with nothing, which is a common theme in the show, and just a perfect ending. And speaking of endings, that is an ending to this video. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found that insightful. I'm curious, if, as always, if you have any insights you'd like to add, if you have any thoughts on my thoughts, leave that in the comments below. Any and all feedback is welcome. I appreciate you coming to the channel and watching the video. If you can remember to like it and to subscribe to the channel, that way you won't miss any future videos, and you'll also be helping me out. That would be appreciated. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you at the next video. Hey guys, this is your annoying reminder to please hit that subscribe button. You'll be helping me out, and you'll also get notified of the next cool video. And check out the other videos on my channel. There's some great stuff over there, all sorts of topics. Take care.